Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to do the review, year in review 1998 for WCW. Now, this is WCW only, guys, because um, I felt like this is the end of WCW for me, because this journey is about my journey as a wrestling fan, growing up as a kid, year by year, and I'm gonna do it from 2000 and from 1992 to 2001, maybe a little bit of 2002. I'm not going to go beyond that after 2002, and I'm not going to go further back than 1992, really. I covered a little bit of 1991 in the 1992 video, and that's pretty much all I'm going to do because it's about my fandom, the memories I have, the vivid memories I have, and how I experienced it. So, with that said, when it comes to this one, WCW, notice I didn't really in the 1992 video, and I didn't really talk about WCW all that much because I didn't really watch WCW until 1993. I got into WWE in 1990 and got into WCW in 93. I didn't. So in the 92 video, WCW is pretty much absent. It's pretty much all WWE, right? Well, here, 1998 is the last year that I really watched WCW. 1999, I'm not going to be able to give you guys a satisfactory review of WCW because I wasn't there. You know what I'm saying? I wasn't watching at that time. And I could go back on the network and review all the 1999 pay-per-views and all the 2000 pay-per-views and the two early ones from 2001 in WCW, but that would be a lie. That would be fake. That would be phony. That would be disingenuous. And that wouldn't be fair to you guys because they're not going to be fair reactions. They're just going to be play-by-plays of stuff that happened. And that's not cool. You know what I mean? I want to give you my real reaction. So 1990, this is my swan song. 1998 will be my swan song to WCW, saying goodbye to WCW. Um, After 5 years of being a fan of theirs, and from there on in, 1999 and 2000 and 2001 is all the WWE. And after that, after 2001, I'll continue on and do a little bit of 2002, but that's the end for WWE because that's when I stopped watching. I didn't stop. Let me rephrase that. Not stop watching because people can say, "Well, you just did a video on CM Punk like last night. You're still watching now." No, what I mean by that is I stopped watching religiously. I stopped watching. Monday Night Nitro wasn't on. Monday Night Raw was still on, but it wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't the same like when I was a kid. I'd grown up by then. By 2001, the latter half of 2001, the early part of 2002, basically after the NWO angle failed in WWE, I was already 18 years old. You know what I mean? We follow my journey from when I was 7 to now I'm 18. I'm different. You know what I mean? I have different interests, girls, music, other friends, and some of it did involve professional wrestling. So it wasn't until much, much later, like I talk about, that I got really back into it, like around 24, 25 years old. You know what I mean? So that's we're going to cover the first part in this series. So I chose to dedicate this particular video to just WCW because this is, like I said, this is my end to WCW. This is my goodbye to WCW. So let's get started. By the end of 1997, I was still pretty much a huge fan, a more bigger fan of WCW than I was the WWF. Of course, the intrigue of the Montreal screw job and what was going on over there had me hooked. Because, like I said, my friend Praveen, that was a close friend of mine, an older kid at school, he was reading the dirt sheets. He was looking at websites. I had discovered WrestleZone along with another friend of mine named David, and we were looking at WrestleZone websites, and we were looking at stuff like this. But and my friends and I still had our own in-school version of the NWO where we were throwing up things, but WWF started to interest me, the whole Montreal school job, because of the backstage machinations, the things that I had never known about, things that I talked about before that I had craved to know because I got in trouble in the early 90s with my parents for calling hotlines. And I got in trouble again in the summer of 1996, late 96, that summer, for doing it again at my grandma's house. You know what I mean? Because I had always craved to know uh, this backstage reports, but getting in on a hotline and having to wait like 4 or 5 minutes to have Mean Gene or Joey Styles in the PWI version of the hotline, just to tell you some BS, it really wasn't worth it. But once I got a computer and once I got plugged into the internet through David and Praveen, I'm like on the computer all the time now looking at dirt sheet stuff. I discovered the Wrestling Observer, and that was right around the time that the Montreal school job happened. So I'm looking for every little thing about the Montreal school job and what's going to happen with Bret Hart. So that's where we left off. We also left off where the NWO is courting him. They come out the next night on Nitro, all Canadian flags. They sing the Canadian national anthem. They're waiting for him to get there. And Rick Rude, who jumped ship, who left the WWF to go to WCW because of him. Brian Adams, who was formerly Crush. It's funny because Brian Adams is a huge part of our journey here. You know what I'm saying? Our time here, because we've talked about him since the very first episode. We talked about how he replaced Bill Eadie in Demolition when Bret Hart and Jim the Anvil Neidhart won their second tag team championships in 1990 at SummerSlam. We talked about in '92 when he debuted in the purple and gold outfit as Kona Crush, and then he was demolished. He was shooting with Doink because Doink was making kids cry, brah. And he was a victim of the two Doinks. Wasn't an illusion, or wasn't it an illusion in the 1993 episode. And then we talked about how he was demolished by Yokozuna, right? And then he came back on on Raw and he blamed Randy Savage for it. And Randy Savage said, "Stay away from these two goofs, brother. They don't do nothing but lead you astray," right? But he didn't listen to Randy Savage, and he busted Savage up, knocking his teeth out and injuring his mouth. And then we talked about how in the '94 episode they had the first Falls Count Anywhere match in the history of the WWF, and I talked about when I was there watching it at WrestleMania 10, it was bullshit because they went to the back and you couldn't see anything, and very little of the match, was out in front of the crowd, and how that was a shame that was Randy Savage's last match, and it was horrible, right? And then we talked about him in that same episode of the King of the Ring in the Go Nowhere match with Yokozuna against the Head Shrinkers, right? And then we talked about him in the '96 episode where he had gone to jail, and then he'd come out and he'd come back to the WWE, and now he's kayfabe, a black Muslim convert, even though he's not black. But hey, he wasn't a foreigner when he was on the Foreign Fanatics in '93 either. Remember, he took the place of Pierre from the Quebecers here, so he's gone from a generic white guy fill-in for Demolition to a Hawaiian babyface to an evil Japanese sympathizing babyface to now he's a black Muslim prisoner. You know what I mean? He joins the Nation of Domination. He has the braids and everything. And we talked about how weird that was. And the Chicago street fight with the Nation of Domination versus Ahmed Johnson and the Road Warriors. And then the Nation of Domination finally breaks up in June of '96. And Farouk says he wants a bigger and blacker Nation of Domination, kicks out Clarence Mason, kicks Kim out, Crush, and kicks out Savio. And then Crush debuts the Disciples of Apocalypse along with The Undertaker and Jacob and Eli Blue, who we also spoke about. But what you'll see happen in 1998 is the gang wars in the WWF will wind down. We'll talk about it when we get to the WWF portion of this this review. But since this is the WCW portion, Brian Adams makes the jump to WCW in solidarity with Bret Hart. He basically comes out. He has an NWO T-shirt under his jacket, and he reveals that he is a member of the NWO. He too has jumped. So now he's no longer Crush. All these years since 1990, for 8 years, different incarnations, different versions, but he's always been Crush. Now he's Brian Adams, which I thought was his fake name because that's the name of a singer, obviously. Yeah, the guy that sings "Have You Ever Loved a Woman," one of my favorite songs from the movie Don Juan that came out in 1995 as well. You know what I mean? That's a lot of nostalgia from the 90s. But no, that's his real name, Brian Adams. He's now the newest member of the NWO. Both he and Rick Rude sympathize with Bret. But the question is, will Bret himself join the NWO? We find out in Starrcade 97 that he did not join the NWO, that he was a sanctioned referee for that night for the Larry Zbyszko Eric Bischoff match in which Nitro was at stake. And he called that one right down the middle, but then Nick Patrick did a screwy count when it came to Sting. It was indecisive. And then he comes down, he restarts the match, he punches Nick Patrick. Sting has Hogan in the Scorpion Deathlock. He says, I'm not going to allow anybody else to get screwed, and that's what he does in Starrcade 1997. So the Bay faces, including Bret Hart, now who's declared his allegiance, he's not an NWO member. He's celebrating with Sting and the other baby faces. But like I said, it makes Hogan look like the heel because Hogan pinned him cleanly. It wasn't a fast count on Nick Patrick's part. Nick Patrick counted normally with normal cadence, but they made it out like it was a fast count. So now the announcers in WCW, Dusty Rhodes, Tony Schiavone, and Bobby the Brain Heenan, they look like liars. And the baby faces, like Sting, looks like a cheater. You know what I mean? And it's like, well, Hogan really won. So it's a whole controversy surrounding it. So we'll see later on down the line that this Sting has to be stripped, and this has to be resolved in a future match, in their return match at Super Bowl 8. But before we go into that, we'll talk a little bit about the Macho Man Randy Savage, Crush's best friend in real life too, and former rival. Macho Man Randy Savage also last year in February of 97 joined the NWO by turning on Roddy Piper. First, he was going all around with Sting. He was a man in the black clothes. Remember, we talked about there were rumors that he was going to return to the WWF. That didn't happen, but he did join the NWO when he had a new look. His feud with Diamond Dallas Page, he offered to put Diamond Dallas over. It was kind of like a reverse of him and Flair. Now he's driving another man crazy with naked photos of his wife. You know what I mean? And that's how DDP's career gets taken to the next level when he beats Randy Savage. Randy Savage told him, I'll take the diamond cutter in the middle of the ring, brother. You know? And now you got guys like Hogan wanting to work with Diamond Dallas Page, which we'll see in this year as well because of that rub from Randy Savage. So, but in 1997, there appears to be some cracks in the ranks of the NWO, especially between Randy Savage and Eric Bischoff, because Randy Savage, consistent with his real life character, his kayfabe character was always pretty much the same way. He never held back. He never held his tongue. He said what he had to say. So he's not going to really, even though he's a member of the NWO, he's not really going to follow anybody, especially not his old rival, Hulk Hogan. So that's a hint into where we're going in the beginning of 1998. But in the very beginning of 1998, it's just a regular feud that he goes into with Lex Luger, and he loses, and the NWO doesn't come out to help him. Now you're wondering, well, why not? You know what I mean? What's the deal with that? He's wondering the same thing. So after sold out 98. Yes, they have sold out again, but this time, even though the NWO didn't get their own show, and even though they didn't become their own promotion because the Nitro before Starrcade '97 it flopped. When they did the vignettes over, the sets over, it flopped. They gave up the idea at this point that the NWO will have their own show, but every pay per view is now referred to as WCW NWO, WCW/NWO. So they've still kind of running with the NWO as being their own promotion, even though they didn't have their own show because um, the execs at Turner have been so happy with Nitro. Wow, the tables had turned in 1998. They've been so happy with Nitro that they wanted to launch a second show on TBS. Once upon a time in the early 1990s, we talked about it in the 92 slash 93 video. Once upon a time, they didn't even want WCW on the air. When Ted Turner first brought the thing 10 years before this, they couldn't wait to kick it off. And then they give them 1 hour every Monday night. Then it expands to 2. Now it expands to a whole nother show. But they don't want to keep repeating the same matches. So that's one of the reasons why they hired Bret Hart. They wanted Thunder to be a WCW themed show where they could give WCW wrestlers like the Luchadors, like Chris Benoit, like Booker T, who's starting to branch out on his own, their own voice. So Thunder basically becomes their show. But now the wrestlers and the writers are feeling overstressed. You know what I mean? Because they didn't hire another writer for Thunder. It's the same people. They kind of stretched themselves way too thin. Over in the WWF, Russo and Ed Ferrara, they're loving this because they think, oh, well, of course they're going to stretch themselves way too thin and their storylines are going to become stale. So if you're going to have Nitro be the main focus of the NWO storyline, the idea that they've come up with is to split the NWO in two. And this is how it starts, with Randy Savage feuding in the ranks with Hulk Hogan. You know, he's now asking Hogan and he's asking Kevin Nash, you know, why weren't you guys there, you know, to back me up against Luger, man? You know what I mean? And he's speaking out against Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash. Now, in the back, unbeknownst to us fans, Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan were actually having creative differences. They were the ones actually beefing it out because Kevin Nash, he'd come from an environment where he and the clique controlled everything in the WWF. He came in as a big boss. But when he came in as the big boss that he was, the huge politician that he was, Hulk Hogan was already politicking. Hulk Hogan was a master politician. Hulk Hogan was doing it way before Kevin Nash was even thought of in the business as a main player. Back when Kevin Nash was in the Diamond Exchange, he was doing it big. So obviously these two, even though they're in the same faction, you know, on screen, they butt heads. And they're butting heads here. One of the major contentions with this that makes them butt heads. Initially on camera, they're still close. It's not until Spring Stampede of this year in April that their team breaks down. They actually are in the tag team match. I believe it's with Luger and the Giant, and they lose, and Kevin Nash decides to align himself with Macho Man. But initially, as the Macho Man and Hulk Hogan feud begins, Kevin Nash is on his side. In fact, one of the first Thunders is a tag team match in which the Macho Man and Sting team together to take on Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash. All the while, Macho Man is still a member of the NWO. So as we head into, like I said, Fall Brawl, Super Brawl 8, Sting and Hogan have that rematch, and Sting decisively defeats Hulk Hogan. Now, there's no question about it. Sting is the champion. So who's his number one contender going to be? It's supposed to be Scott Hall, but Scott Hall, uh, he does get the shot because he's won World War III. I never understood where this was going because they had no intentions of putting the belt on Scott. So why did they have him have the match at Super Brawl 8? I mean, unsent. Excuse me, no. Oh yes, uncensored 1998. If they never intended to put the belt on him, but whatever. I think it was like a background focus. Here you had Sting as the champion now, and he's in the background. He was the main star of 1997, but he's in the background now, taking a back seat to Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan, who are having a cage match in uncensored. Because everyone's talking about, well, there's dissension in the ranks of the NWO, right? What else is happening at the sold out pay per view? Well, finally, we're going to get the match that we didn't get at Starrcade '97 between the Giant and Kevin Nash. Apparently, the Giant was supposed to, well, not apparently, he was on the card to wrestle Kevin Nash um, at Starrcade, but apparently he had a heart attack, a legitimate heart attack, and Scott Hall comes down and tells the Giant that he had this heart attack. So they don't have the match. Now they have the match at Sold Out '98, and the Giant, since the time that he debuted with the company in '95, has put on considerable amount of weight. This would become an issue with the Big Show / the Giant when he would leave WCW to go to the WWE in 1999 as well. He put on a considerable amount of weight, and he became very immobile, and that's crazy to think about because when he first debuted with the company, he was very mobile. He was doing drop kicks and everything. You'll hear Paul White, the current Paul White, he's not with AEW, talk about how he used to do that stuff, and the WCW official tone it down because it wasn't appropriate for a guy his size. But at this point in '98, he's slow, he's sluggish. Uh, Kevin Nash can't even get him up for a power bomb, and when he gets him up for the power bomb, he drops him and almost breaks his neck for real. So they turned this into a storyline in which, and this would become a thing in '98, where they would turn real life into storyline. They turned this into a storyline where J.J. Dillon bans the power bomb. And there's one episode of Nitro where they're locking Kevin Nash up, and he's like Scott Hall. He's a big movie buff. So he's taking a page out of Al Pacino, Al Pacino scene from Dog Day Afternoon, and they're locking him up, and he's yelling, "Attica, Attica, Attica," which is of course a reference to the movie, but the movie referenced the 1971 Attica riots, right? So Nash is hilarious. You know what I mean? Some of his references, like even when you watch his podcast, Click This, you wouldn't really get some of his references because he's a very well-read man and a very intelligent man. And like, if you're not clued into the know, you wouldn't really get it. You know what I mean? But that's what I enjoy about him. You know what I mean? Like you could listen to one of his podcasts and he does with Sean Oliver, or even the videos he used to do back in the day, kayfabe commentaries, and just not talking about wrestling, basically talking about geopolitics, talking about life, talking about philosophy, and he really goes into a lot of stuff, and especially movies, and he's very witty with it. You know what I mean? So that's a perfect example of that. You know what I'm saying? What else is going on here at Sold Out '98? What's going on with Scott Hall? Well, obviously, like I said, he doesn't receive his title shot because there's the discrepancy. They don't know who the real champion is. But he is in this feud with Larry Zbyszko. The feud with Larry Zbyszko started, of course, it really started when the NWO first came out, and Larry Zbyszko started to refer to him as the New World Order. Lame joke, I know. But each and every time the NWO would come out and they would kick out the announcers, Larry Zbyszko was often the announcer for WCW at this time, especially for the first hour of WCW, and he wouldn't want to leave. But Larry was very over. Like Larry had already done this in 1994 with Lord Steven Regal, and for like a month he held the television championship. So he'd already come out of retirement, and wrestled a wrestler. He'd been in retirement since '92. He was part of the Dangerous Alliance. He was in that War Games. He was part of the Enforcers with Arn Anderson as a tag team partner, right? Both Mid South alum. A lot of people don't know that Arn Anderson actually, even though he's from Georgia, he actually started out not in Georgia Championship Wrestling, but in the Mid South territory as Mr. Olympia and as Marty Lundy, and it was the Junkyard Dog who gave him his gimmick of the Anderson of Arn Anderson, because he said he's like the Junkyard Dog's like, damn, he looks like an Anderson, and Arn does look like an Anderson. For those who don't know, the Andersons are a reference to a kayfabe tag team, which Ole Anderson was a part of, Gene Anderson, Lars Anderson, the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, which was basically uh, Lars and Gene. But then they expanded it to Ole and Gene, uh, and then Arn. And then when Ric Flair comes to the Carolinas in '74, they introduced Ric Flair as the cousin of Ole and Arn and Gene, the cousin of the Andersons, and that's how they get connected. But Marty Lundy, aka Arn Anderson, does really look like an Anderson. He's not an Anderson. Neither is Ole. Ole's real name is Al Rogowski. He's Polish. He's far from an Anderson. you know, you know what I mean. But Arn, they both look like Anderson. So JYD gives him that name, and before Arn goes to the Carolinas or to Georgia and hooks up with Flair, he's in Mid South. So basically, uh, he and Larry Zbyszko are Mid South alumni, because Larry Zbyszko actually wrestled in Mid South as well, before wrestling in the AWA and getting married after wrestling in the WWF, the territory he broke into with Bruno Sammartino as his trainer. He had some disputes. He won the tag titles with Tony Correa in the mid '70s. He had some disputes with Vince McMahon after the payoff, because he was getting over. He claims he was getting over more than Bob Backlund in the territory, and probably he was, right? But of course, Vince Sr. didn't want that to happen. So in 1980, he goes back down to Mid South before coming up to the AWA, and he finally marries Vern Gagne's daughter. Vern Gagne was always trying to get guys to marry his daughter so he could keep the title in his family. You know what I mean? Because that was how it was done in the territory days. Wrestling promoters wanted to have their sons be wrestlers, so that if when they know they or their sons be wrestlers, so when they could no longer wrestle, at least the title and the business would be in safe hands. But some guys had sons that couldn't draw money, like George Goulis in the Nashville territory, or Mike Graham in the Eddie Graham's son in the Florida territory, or Greg Gagne. Greg Gagne was a great tag team wrestler, but he wasn't going to be the kind of draw that Vern was. So Vern was looking for a wrestler to marry one of his daughters. Ricky Steamboat went out with one of his daughters. That's how he got broken into the business. Before he got broken into the business, Hulk Hogan, when he was there, when he was setting the world on fire in the AWA in the early '80s, Gagne tried to get him with his daughter. But none of it worked, because Hogan hooked up with Linda, and out in California when he was filming Rocky III, and Ricky Steamboat hooked up with his wife Bonnie. In 1980, 88, 87, 88, when they had their first son Richie. So. But Larry Zbyszko actually does hook up with Vern Gagne's daughter, and he becomes because he's basically the last AWA champion. But anyway, I'm on a tangent here. Then he comes back. He wants to do this invasion angle with the AWA and WCW, but AWA means nothing in 1991 when he wants to do it. So he just comes back to WCW. He's been there before, and they put him with the Dangerous Alliance, and he teams with Arn Anderson for a while, and they kind of fit. But anyway, he retired in 1992, but in 1994 they brought him back, and he won the television title from Lord Steven Regal, held it for a couple of months, and then just went back to being an announcer. But now that the NWO is here, he's getting back into it, and he wants to wrestle again. He's already refereed, right? The Luger and Scott Hall match at Halloween Havoc in '97. Um, he's a friend of Scott Hall's in real life because Hall was an AWA guy. Hall, he didn't start his career in the AWA. Obviously, he started in the Florida territory too. But when he had his first big break, it was in Minnesota. And Scott Hall was another guy that Vern Gagne wanted to stay, and Vern Gagne wanted to mold. He wanted to mold him to be kind of like his version of Magnum TA, because Scott Hall in the early days, when he was big Scott Hall in the AWA, he looked kind of like Magnum TA. He had the blonde hair, the blonde mustache, looked just like Magnum TA. And Magnum TA at that time, in both Mid South and in JCP, when he switched over in '86, he was burning it up. He was about to be that guy before his motorcycle accident, right? I went off on a lot of tangents, but that didn't happen. And being a Florida boy, Scott Hall thought, Minnesota's too cold. I can't deal with this. I'm not going to be like Kurt Hennig going ice fishing and shit in the winter. Hell with that. Even though he and Hennig were a tag team, he didn't want Vern's belt. He said, keep your belt. And then that's when he quit the business for a while. He went to Germany. He went to Puerto Rico, went a couple of other places, and he got his big break down in WCW in the early 90s with him and DDP. And DDP basically changed up his look. So he didn't look like he looked when he was Starship Coyote, or when he was Big Scott Hall, and it was Gator Scott Hall in the early JCP incarnations. He looked completely different as a diamond stud, and he took that diamond stud look and he went to WWE with it, as we talked about with Razor Ramon. But before that, in the AWA, he and Larry Zbyszko were friends, and they had this match in which Larry Zbyszko actually, when he and Larry went to a draw, and Larry tells him, throw your hands up like you won. And he does that. You know what I mean? He actually does. He throws his hands up like he won. And that's a good piece of advice, because that got him over big time as a baby face. Because Larry was, from the time he turned on Bruno in 1980, even when he went to other promotions, he was always a heel. Right now, though, he's a baby face because he's WCW, and the WCW wrestlers are baby faces, right? So you got two Minnesota alumni working with one another in Larry Zbyszko and Scott Hall. But Larry's only the referee in the Halloween Havoc 97 match. Now, he has the match with Eric Bischoff, again, another AWA alumni. Man, there's a lot of AWA guys, too, in WCW now. A guy who, Eric Bischoff, we talked about it. He was in the AWA for a while. He was in the AWA till it closed in 91. It got to the point where him and his wife, Lori, they couldn't even afford food. They were so poor and so destitute. He took the place of Larry Nelson, who was one of the coked out announcers from the 1980s. He couldn't take it no more. Funny story with Larry Nelson. There's this interview when the Rockers were in the AWA of Larry Nelson interviewing Shawn Michaels. And apparently during this interview, Shawn Michaels is getting a blowjob while Larry Nelson is interviewing. But anyway, Larry Nelson leaves the AWA, and it's Eric Bischoff who takes his place. So just like how Marty O'Neill left the promotion before that, and Mean Gene took his place, Larry Nelson leaves the AWA and Eric Bischoff takes his place. But what happens? Pretty soon, the AWA closes down. Eric Bischoff goes to apply for a job with the WWF. There's the old video of where where Vince McMahon gives him a broom and is like, sell me this broom. And he's doing his audition. He doesn't get hired. So he calls WCW. He goes down there and he's a third string announcer. I can remember him doing shows with Missy Hyatt, like the first Battle Bowl, for example. And, no luck really in the wrestling business, just a steady job, with Turner's money because they had guarantees. And that's one of the things Larry Zbyszko tells him, keep your nose clean in here, kid, because we have unlike anywhere else in the wrestling business, we have guaranteed money. We have, they're never going to stop paying us because it's guaranteed money. We could just milk it as long as we need to. So that's what Eric's going to do until Bill Watts gets fired, and there's a job for the executive producer, like we talked about before. He does that. So all these guys, Scott Hall and Eric Bischoff and Larry Zbyszko, they're all familiar with each other. They're all from that Minnesota territory. That's where they came up. Even though Larry's from Pittsburgh, again, we just talked about it, how he made that journey from the Northeast territory to the Midwest. So they're all kind of familiar with one another. So they come up with the angle to bring Larry Zbyszko once again out of retirement, just like in 1994, and have him wrestle Scott Hall. So that's what they're doing here at Sold Out 98, a match between Scott Hall and Larry Zbyszko. So they're having the match. The referee's knocked out, and Dusty Rhodes makes his way down. Now you think, okay, Dusty Rhodes is an announcer. He's a longtime babyface. Dusty Rhodes turned babyface in 1974 in Florida during the feud with Pac Song Man. You know what I mean? He was a heel, but he was such a beloved heel, such a badass heel, much like Stone Cold Steve Austin of the mid-'70s, that the fans fell in love with him. And plus, he's taken on Pac Song Man, a Korean, who we're not that far removed from the Korean War. There are people there that still remember the Korean War. As a matter of fact, Steve Kern's father was both the World War II vet and a Vietnam vet. So, and he was wrestling in the promotion at that time. Steve Kern, of course, Skinner. WWF fans would know him as. He was wrestling there then. So anti-Asian sentiment, anti-Korean sentiment is a thing in professional wrestling, even then in 74. So that's what, and the feud with Gary Hart is what turns Dusty into a babyface, and Dusty becomes the hottest thing since sliced bread in the Florida territory, burns up the Florida territory, even starts booking under the learning tree of Eddie Graham, who many consider to be the best booker in professional wrestling. Eddie Graham learned his stuff from Roy Shires, who learned his stuff from Fred Kohler, who learned his stuff from Sam Mushnick. It all traces back to Sam Mushnick somehow. But anyway, Dusty learned it under Eddie Graham. And all the time, wrestlers always say Eddie Graham was the best finish guy in the business. Eddie Graham was the best finish guy in the business. You know what I mean? So he had the idea to turn Dusty into a babyface, and Playboy Gary Hart, who was managing Pac Song Man at the time, helped him do that. And Dusty became the biggest thing since sliced bread. Before you know it, 3 years later, he was coming down in New York. He was having matches with superstar Billy Graham, Texas Bull Rope matches. There was talk that Vince Sr., when he wanted to go national, Dusty was one of the people that he had in mind. He had four people in mind. Jimmy Superfly Snuka, who was big in his territory at the time, Dusty Rhodes, Kerry Von Erich, and Hulk Hogan. Ultimately, he went with Hulk Hogan, but he could have went with Dusty Rhodes because Dusty had a tremendous run when he went down to Jim Crockett Promotions in '83 to be the booker for Jim Crockett Promotions, because they just got rid of George Scott. So they were taking a new direction, moving away from their traditional style of booking that they were doing in the Carolinas and getting ready to go national with it. So, point being, Dusty Rhodes was a huge, huge baby face, the biggest baby face in the world, baby. But what does he do? He turns heel. He helps Scott Hall. Now, what's the relationship in real life between he and Scott Hall? Like I said, keep in mind, Florida, that's Scott Hall's hometown. He grew up in Florida. He's a Florida native. And Dusty Rhodes, baby, was the biggest star in the history of Florida uh, championship wrestling from Florida, Eddie Graham's territory, based out of the Sportatorium in Tampa. That's where Hulk Hogan got his start. That's where Ron Simmons got his start. Lex Luger got his start down there. A lot of wrestlers got their start. They were trained in the ring by Japanese wrestler Hiro Matsuda. You know, we all know that story about Hulk Hogan where Hiro Matsuda broke his leg and then dared him not to come back, right? But that's the Florida territory. So that Dusty actually broke Scott Hall in. And Dusty was the one who gave him the idea for Starship Coyote. When Dusty went to the Carolinas, Dusty brought him to the Carolinas, him and Dan Spivey. So they have a close relationship, just like him and Larry Zbyszko have this close relationship. So we're talking about all veterans here. You know what I mean? And and but the point is, Dusty Rhodes turns heel. Dusty Rhodes have been you talk about Hulk Hogan being a babyface. Hulk Hogan, yeah, he was more well known because he was in the WWF, right? And the WWF was a national promotion and all that. But Dusty Rhodes was Hulk Hogan before Hulk Hogan. A lot of Hulk Hogan's rap, just like a lot of the rap of superstar Billy Graham, they got from Dusty Rhodes. You know what I'm saying? What came first, the chicken or the egg? Who did it first, Superstar or Dusty? Who knows? But they were two of the most charismatic, jive-talking white dudes in the world. In fact, the early Dusty Rhodes promos, he didn't even, like, we look back at the Dusty Rhodes that was doing bull rope matches, right, and doing bunkhouse stampedes and shit, right, in the mid to late 80s. But if you go back and you look at the Dusty Rhodes from the 70s, baby, you know, the Dusty Rhodes from the 70s was like he was black. You know what I mean? He was talking like he was black, You know, many people say, and rightfully so, that he got his gimmick from Thunderbolt Patterson, a black wrestler that was popular in the early 70s on Georgia Championship Wrestling, basically the top star of Georgia Championship Wrestling. And probably did. But the point is, Dusty took it national. That road, baby. You know, he took it to the pay window, as he would say, as a babyface, a black babyface. That he wasn't black, but he had a black style. He had a black comeback. You know what they would call in the wrestling business a black comeback. What does that mean? Well, black babyfaces in wrestling, when they would make their comeback, they would dance around. They would dance around and stuff. So they called that a quote unquote black comeback. But anyway, Dusty Rhodes, he was cultural appropriation before cultural appropriation. Anyway. So, but now he's a heel. He's never been a heel for years and years. For like 20 years, he was a straight up babyface. So he joins the NWO, and it's like now everybody's in the NWO. Not Dusty Rhodes in the NWO. You know what I mean? He turns on Larry Zbyszko. He comes out. He was like, I'm tired of being that corporate cowboy, if you will. I was tired of carrying around Tony Schiavone and, tired of having to cheer for your favorites, baby. I was tired of being the one to have to put over on WCW Saturday night, baby. These losers in WCW. So I jumped ship to the NWO, baby. he basically joins the NWO as the manager of Scott Hall. So the Giants injured. Randy Savage now has a problem with the rest of the NWO members and basically puts them in the same position as the WCW baby faces. And he does team with them. But we're going in Uncensored 96. Now, notoriously, again, Uncensored is a shitty paper. Uncensored is one of the worst pay per views of all time. Remember Ric Flair in the dress in 94, 95, the Tower of Doom match in 96, the match that I said that I ordered instead of WrestleMania 13 in 97, where Sting declared his allegiance. So we all remember that, right? And uh, Sting at this time was huge. Like I said, Sting was the biggest wrestler of 1997. I dressed up as Sting for Halloween. In the last Halloween that I ever went trick or treating, and that's how much. Even though I was an NWO fan, I kind of liked Sting. I kind of liked his style. You know what I mean? But now he's being pushed to the side for Macho Man. And the main event for Uncensored 98 was the Macho Man Randy Savage versus Hulk Hogan. And this match sucked. You know what I mean? Every time the Macho Man and Hulk Hogan wrestled, and it was after 1988, 10 years later, they didn't have the chemistry. But they would wrestle again down the line. So Randy Savage is teaming with the baby faces. He's doing his thing with the baby faces. And the baby faces, Luger and Sting, are coming to his aid. And this is happening until Spring Stampede, when the team of Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash finally breaks up. And what does Kevin Nash do? He helps Randy Savage defeat Sting for the WCW Championship. So now Randy Savage is the WCW champion for the third time. The next night on Nitro, who challenges him but Hulk Hogan? You have another shitty Hulk Hogan Randy Savage match. Bret Hart comes out to save him from Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash comes out to do the powerbomb to Hogan like he did to Sting at Spring Stampede. Bret Hart comes out and nails Nash with the title. There's a reignition of a feud we talked about in 1994, 1995. The Bret Hart and Kevin Nash feud. Finally, Bret Hart is doing something because for the last 2 months, who did he wrestle? He wrestled Ric Flair and he wrestled Kurt Hennig. Two guys that he'd already wrestled in WWF, but like I said, they wanted to do something where WCW got their own storylines and NWO got their own storylines. So the top NWO storyline is Savage and Hogan, and then later Savage and Luger teaming together against Hogan and Nash, and then Savage and Nash. It got really confused and convoluted, but now they just said, fuck all that, and Bret Hart is now your newest member of, he's a Hulk Hogan, becomes a Hulk Hogan lackey for the rest of the year. And that's all he pretty much does. But in May 19th, 1998, which is an interesting date that they chose to launch this on this date. On this episode of Nitro, Kevin Nash and Randy Savage come out, and they've got new colors on. They've got the NWO Wolfpack colors. So now they've officially declared their allegiance to the NWO Wolfpack. They've officially separated from the NWO Hollywood. They've already been having matches with the NWO Hollywood or the original NWO, but they're now a separate group. And I say this is an interesting date because this is the same date, May 19th, that the curtain call happened 2 years before that. You know what I'm saying? And they get Conan to join them. They get Rick Rude and Kurt Hennig to join them, which is crazy because now Rick Rude is a babyface now. He's been managing Kurt Hennig, but this won't last long. Eventually, Kurt Hennig will turn on them and join the NWO Black and White, which becomes the NWO Hollywood. And the Wolfpack, they get their own song by C. Murder of No Limit Soldiers, which No Limit is really popular at this time. And they become popular. And Wolfpack shirts, man, who didn't love that shit? That was burning up the summer in 1998. Another guy that was burning up the summer in 1998 was Bill Goldberg. He continues his restless, his his winning streak, just plowing through opponents. And people are like, he's the man, he's the man. And then by like March or April, he defeats Raven. Now, what's Raven doing? Raven has made the jump from ECW to the WCW. Now, on this series, we didn't talk about Raven's feud that he had with Sandman that was a revolutionary feud. He actually turned Sandman's son Tyler Fullington against him in a cult. This is a cultish time. This is the time of David Koresh, the time of the Waco raid, the time of well, Heaven's Gate didn't happen. Heaven's Gate happened like a year or so before, but cults are really on the minds of people mainly because of Waco and Koresh. So he takes advantage of that when he goes to ECW, and he creates a cult-like character, Raven's Nest, where he's attracting, like I said, the Sandman's son, Stevie Richards, Blue Meanie, and he's this grunge-type character. His grunge music had just hit in the early 90s with Nirvana's Nevermind in 1991. So, again, Paul Heyman is doing that. But we didn't really talk about that. The last time we kind of talked about Scott Levy, a.k.a. Johnny Polo, a.k.a. Scotty Flamingo, a.k.a. Raven, was in 1994 when he was managing the Quebecers, and for a while in early 93 when he was managing Adam Bomb. We didn't really speak about him otherwise, speak about him as a wrestler, because we focus here on the WWF and WCW, and he wasn't a wrestler in the WWF, and his time in WCW was before we started this series, like in the early 90s. We used to roll with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash in the early 90s when he was there. You know what I'm saying? But he went to ECW, made a name for himself, and because of Todd Gordon was the owner of ECW, the second owner of ECW. After Joel Goodhart, who was a local promoter, sold it, Todd Gordon got involved. Todd Gordon owned a local jewelry store, a famous jewelry store, like dating back to the 1800s in Philadelphia. And he was a wrestler. He grew up a wrestling fan. He wanted to get involved with this business, so he bought Joel Goodhart's Tri-State Wrestling Alliance promotion. It became Eastern Championship Wrestling. And Paul Heyman gets fired from WCW in '93 because of the problems that he has with Watts. Then what happens is he then takes over the booking. After Eddie Gilbert passes away, he takes over the booking for ECW. He turns the promotion around. They have the NWA tournament because, again, WCW is not with the NWA anymore because of the Disney tapings. So the NWA has to affiliate themselves with another promotion. So they affiliate themselves with Eastern Championship Wrestling. It doesn't turn out well for them. In the final, Shane Douglas, the former Dynamic Dude, defeats a.k.a. Dean Douglas. He defeats Too Cold Scorpio. He does the interview then. It was August 26, 1993. We talked about it in the 93 video where he says to all the NWA, his father had just passed away, so he dedicated the win to his father, where he says to all the former NWA champions, Dory Funk, Terry Funk, who's there in the promotion, Dusty Rhodes, and especially Ric Flair, who he hates, who he credits with holding him down when Flair was booking in like 89, 90. He says, "You can all kiss my ass." And he says, "Forget the NWA Eastern Championship Wrestling title. This is the WCW, the ECW Championship." And that's when it becomes ECW. But anyway, Todd Gordon, like I said, is the original owner. He has his Philly faction with Hack, a.k.a. the Sandman, Too Cold Scorpio, and his guys, and Raven is among them. And Paul Heyman has his New York guys, Tommy Dreamer and Taz and the Dudley Boys later when they bring them in. You know what I mean? But these guys, they're looking for a better payday. Paul Heyman is we all know that from hearing the stories that Paul Heyman, a.k.a. Paulie Dangerously, Paulie, is a notorious liar. You know what I mean? He never paid the wrestlers. He would tell them their checks in the mail, and they would say, "Well, what's the tracking number to my specific check? How can I track my check?" And he would make up a number. They would say, "Paul, wait a minute, that number's too short." He said, "Oh, I add another one." You know what I mean? So basically, he's a liar and a thief, and he's stealing from these wrestlers, right? And that's eventually how ECW goes out of business in 2001, right? But at this point, Todd Gordon sees himself being edged out of the company. I just got Todd Gordon's book. I just listened to Todd Gordon's book, Todd is God, with Sean Oliver. Again, the guy that works on Click This with Kevin Nash. It's a pretty good book. He basically tells his side of the story, but Paul Heyman goes around saying that Todd Gordon is a mole. He's influencing the ECW locker room, because the way they looked at the ECW locker room wasn't like how they looked at the WCW or the WWE locker room. The way they looked at it was kind of like, speaking of cults, was kind of like a cult leader. And people today will still talk about, oh, the wrestlers in the ECW, they drank Paul Heyman's Kool-Aid. Now, what is the drinking of the Kool-Aid a reference to? Obviously, it's a reference to the Guyana Massacre in 1978 by Jim Jones, People's Temple. Right? So they try to position that Paul Heyman is kind of like that. Paul Heyman is he has the wrestlers brainwashed. But Todd Gordon is telling them no. You could get better deals over here in WCW. So he starts to communicate with Eric Bischoff, telling him, listen, I can get a bunch of ECW guys to come into the company and we could do an ECW invasion. And Bischoff is down for it, because in early '95, he basically raided all of ECW's talent. He took all the luchadors. He took Public Enemy. He took Sabu initially, right? Mr. JL. He took a bunch of them in '95. Even Kevin Sullivan. When Kevin Sullivan came back to WCW, was part of that ECW acquisition, because they were working together. A lot of people don't realize that in year one of ECW, them and WCW were working together. Even when Cactus Jack was tag team champions with Kevin Sullivan, they sent Cactus down to ECW to work against Kevin Sullivan. And that's when Cactus got in trouble for spitting on the belt. Ric Flair calls him up and says, "Hey, why are you defaming the WCW title like that? Spitting on it and shit." So they had a working relationship. Arn Anderson went down there for a while. Road Warrior Hawk went down there for a while. So ECW and WCW did have a working relationship in the beginning. So Todd Gordon did know Bischoff to some extent. So he contacts Bischoff. He says, I can get Raven, I can get Stevie Richards, I can get a whole bunch of ECW guys to go down there. So Paul Heyman positions him as a mole, but he really isn't a mole. He's just telling guys, look, you can get a better deal in WCW than you can in ECW. Just like Larry Zbyszko was telling Eric Bischoff, when he first got there, guaranteeing money and everything. Same reason why a lot of the WWF guys jumped, why Scott Hall and Kevin Nash jumped, because guaranteed money, man. Who doesn't want guaranteed money? Who wants to know? Who wants to know, be in the dark about what they're getting paid, from show to show. People want something that they could hang their hat on, that they could, buy a new house or buy a new car, some money coming in that's guaranteed, not some money, or depending on how much I draw or whatever. So guys wanted to go down there for a sweet deal. And that's what happened with Raven. So the ECW invasion doesn't pan out because Todd Gordon, just says fuck it, and he allows Paul Heyman to take over because he threw his hands up with the promotion after 1997. But they still want to do the whole Ravens flock thing. So Stevie Richards is there for a while. Steve Richards, and then they kick him out. They debut in August of '97, and they have Lodi there. They have a bunch of people, and it's basically like he'll turn jobbers like Scotty Riggs and Billy Kidman into his followers, and they're looking all dirty and dingy. Saturn is there, Perry Saturn from the Eliminators, and he's Raven's flock. This is his group. So by the middle of the year, he becomes U.S. champion. Yeah, he also has Ron Reese, the former Yeti, Big Ron Stud, and he has Horace Hogan, Hulk Hogan's nephew, in the group. So by the middle of the year, he's wrestling Goldberg. Goldberg's finally got up to him. He's the U.S. champion. He has an amazing feud with Chris Benoit and DDP also around that time, a Bowery death match, which really put DDP on the map. Because again, they were friends from back in the day. You know, just like with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. So Goldberg defeats him. It's funny, they hit Goldberg with a sign. Goldberg no sells, and Goldberg's now your U.S. champion. He's climbing up the ladder further and further. But the more and more you get into it, the more and more you hear Goldberg, Goldberg chants, Goldberg. Now, people say, okay, that was just his name. That's where they got it from. But bullshit. Any kid that grew up in the 90s knew that Goldberg chant came from the movie The Mighty Ducks. Sean Wintz's character of the fat kid Goldberg, who was the goalie in The Mighty Ducks, started that chant. Bill Goldberg, the wrestler, didn't start that chant. But anyway, he became famous for it. Goldberg, Goldberg. And then his entrance was cool because he would come from it would start off in the back, and then he would have the security guy, Doug Dillinger, knock on the door, and he would come out with a bunch of security like he was a professional fighter, and he would come out with the sparks and everything. He's really getting over, right? And they think he could be the savior for the baby faces of WCW because Sting was knocked down a lot of pegs when he failed to beat Hulk Hogan clean, like we talked about. And now Sting is no longer even the champion. The belt is back in Hogan's hands. And Hogan has his faction of the NWO Hollywood. Raven has his faction of Raven's Flock. And Kevin Nash and Macho Man formed their faction by unveiling the black and red NWO. Like I said, they get Conan to join. They get Mr. Perfect, Kurt Hennig to join for a little while, along with Rick Rude, until Kurt Hennig tells Conan to sub for him in a match at the Great American Bash, and he does, and then Conan loses to Goldberg, and then Hennig and Rude beat him up. And apparently Rick Rude was planning a return to the ring at this time, but it wouldn't be materialized because unfortunately Rick would pass away not so long after this. But what about Scott Hall? Scott Hall hasn't been seen on TV, but people just assume that both he and Dusty Rhodes are going to be members of the Red and Black because he's Kevin Nash's best friend. He's Kevin Nash's tag team partner. They've been down the roads together. But they have a match coming up with Sting and the Giant. Sting and the Giant win the tag team championships from Harlem Heat. Harlem Heat is on their way out to breaking up. They really want to split Booker off into a singles wrestler, which they'll do later on in the year. He and Chris Benoit will have their best of 7 series for the television championship. Also, a returning Rick Martel. Rick Martel will come into the company, and him and Booker will have an amazing set of matches. Booker T's about to be a star in '98. Conan too, like the whole Arriba la Raza. He has this whole spiel where he says, like Scott Hall has the survey. He has, yo, let me speak on this. And he says, the NWO is bout it, and round and round. I really forget what his thing was, but his thing was like a long thing with a lot of crowd participation. And the whole summer of '97, the Wolfpack is burning it up. But who else joins the Wolfpack that you wouldn't expect? And this is where I'm going to end part 1. Who else joins the Wolfpack that you would not expect to join the Wolfpack? Lex Luger. Lex Luger, because they're baby faces now. They're not tweeners anymore. Lex Luger gets the offer to join the Wolfpack. He joins the Wolfpack. Now he's listening to DMX, who had his first album out at that time. And he's wearing FUBU jeans. And he's dressing cool. He's dressing hip-hop, right? And Miss Elizabeth's in there because she's with Macho Man. And that would eventually lead to them hooking up, later on in the year. Her and Macho Man aren't together anymore. But who else joins the Wolfpack? Sting. Now they have this whole thing again in '98 where Hollywood's team is courting. Because remember, Sting is the tag team champion. Sting is the tag team contender with the Giants. They're not tag team champions yet. My mistake. Slamboree '98, which it's coming time for me to get off, but I want to touch briefly on Slamboree 98. Remember I said that I never ordered WCW pay-per-views. I only ordered Uncensored 97, uh, Sold Out 97, and Slamboree 98. Well, we're here at Slamboree 98, and I'll tell you why I ordered this pay-per-view. DX. Now, it's hard to really talk about this storyline without talking about the WWF and what happened with the WWF after WrestleMania 14. Basically, Shawn Michaels loses the WWF Championship to Stone Cold Steve Austin in a spectacular match that involved Mike Tyson as the enforcer. We'll talk about it when we get to the WWF. So he gets kicked out of DX the night after WrestleMania. And Triple H tells him that he dropped the ball. Now, we talked about the NWO thing, and one of the things that contributed to the NWO's beef backstage was the firing of Sean Waltman. Sean Waltman 6 was let go, and they brought it into an on-camera storyline where Hulk Hogan is saying, oh, he can't cut the mustard, right? 6 couldn't cut the mustard. So the night after WrestleMania, on Monday Night Raw, X-Pac comes out. He makes his big return, right? The 1-2-3 Kid, the former 1-2-3 Kid, has returned to the WWF. He does the interview, and it was kind of like CM Punk in a way. You know, he does the interview where he says, Hulk Hogan, your head, Eric Bischoff, your head is so far off Hulk Hogan's ass, you could tell what he had for breakfast. And he says, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash will be standing right here with us if they weren't being held hostage by World Championship Wrestling. And that's a fact, Eric Bischoff. And Triple H says, when you're building an army, you look to your buddies, you look to your friends, you look to the clique. And then 6 comes out, who's now X-Pac, right? That's his new name. But later on that night, Cactus Jack and Terry Funk have a cage match with the New Age Outlaws, and they join DX. So now they're the DX Army. And that's where we're going to leave off, the DX Army and Slamboree 98. And we'll talk about them in the next part. Sorry, guys. Love you guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button. See you in my next video. That's part 1.